Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the fourth weekend of June 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Established in 2019 by the Franklin News Foundation, the Center Square publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news, focusing on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories and add insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist. Today, we'll discuss the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran. We'll hear about the shooter who targeted several Minnesota lawmakers, and we'll look at the latest inside the Nippon U.S. Steel merger. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the Middle East, it's Dan McCaleb.
President Donald Trump says he'll decide within the next couple of weeks on whether the U.S. will engage in military action against Iran. Israel and Iran have been engaged in a bombing campaign against each other for over a week. Israel and Trump say Iran is too close to building a nuclear bomb, something both vowed can't happen. Joining me to discuss developments in the ongoing battle is Sarah Roderick Fitch, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Sarah, you've been covering this story since Israel launched its preemptive strikes last week. Tell us more about where the U.S. is at in potentially joining the major conflict.
Right now, it looks like it's just kind of a wait and see game. I'm not exactly sure, where Trump is saying 2 weeks. I think, honestly, that 2 weeks is there to sort of see where how things are developing. Quite frankly, Israel seems to be doing fairly well without American help and assistance. And even the latest development is that Israel is saying that they can even take out the they can use a bunker buster. They can take out the Fardo, which is where the big nuclear site is. And so I think Trump just is kind of like right now waiting and seeing, but he's saying that there's some negotiations behind the scenes. I think that the UK may be involved. I'm not exactly sure if France is involved in that as well. France has generally had somewhat amicable relationship with Iran for different years. So they've been very crucial in talks before, especially with the previous Iranian deal. So it's just interesting to see, especially with the NATO summit coming up this week or next week, where that will, where things will play out there. Maybe there'll be some more negotiations behind the scenes there. We'll see what happens. But I think at this point, President may be kind of hoping that things are resolved within the maybe next couple of weeks. And maybe Israel can kind of take it on themselves and they won't need the United States. But not exactly sure that is going to be the case, especially and the Iranians have also said that they have moved a lot of their nuclear stuff, that they're hiding it in different places. So that could just be a tactic. It may or may not be true. We're not exactly sure. I'm pretty sure that the Iranians pretty confident in their intelligence. I am pretty sure that they would be able to see and know, since especially they have air superiority right now.
Sir, President Trump, both on the campaign trail last year and since he became president in January, says he wants peace. He does not want war. He vowed to end the the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas war, and now here it is. We're on the brink of possibly entering the war between Israel and Iran. But this is a bit of a different situation. Both President Trump and Israel and certainly plenty of others have said Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb or nuclear bombs. Iran has vowed to annihilate Israel and the United States. So I think this is different than the other conflicts, potentially more dangerous. What do you think here?
It is dangerous. There is that nuclear facility, but then also at the same time, I think that there's a lot of hesitancy not just from the Trump administration, but from from Republicans and Democrats, obviously not wanting to get into another Afghanistan situation or Iraq situation, where it's just sort of this ongoing, never-ending war. And I think there's just that apprehension, sort of a PTSD, really, in fact. But I think where Iran is different is that something that it's culturally, it's very different from Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. It's actually somewhat more similar culturally to Israelis, as far as they're very highly educated, very civilized. They have a long civilization, all of this. And 80%, or actually over 80% of Iranians do not like the government, the regime. They have tried to topple them twice in the past 20 years and almost been successful. So I think that there's kind of a difference. And I think that, I don't think that would probably be necessary for like a ground invasion. I think there's that fear. And I think that sort of Israel sort of knows, just based on, what they took out with Hezbollah and somewhat Hamas and everything like that. They were very successful in that, sort of taking up the leadership and trying to solve it from the leadership standpoint. But the thing is that it could be, I think it very well could sort of take care of itself in a sense. And I think that's where Trump is sort of looking at it, is with the nuclear stuff. If you take away the nuclear powers and sort of that threat away from the Iranian regime, it sort of takes away a lot of their power within their own people. And I know that the outside world already knows that, is that there's a lot of movement. There's the Iranian people, videos that I have seen, from inside Iran, as, the Iranian people are really excited, they're happy about this. They want this. This is something that they've been wanting. So, that's where it's really different, is that it really is kind of all right, take care of the weapons and whatnot, and then maybe go from there. And it may sort of take care of itself in a sense. And I think that, like I said, that Trump is sort of hoping that things sort of work itself out and Israel can do the dirty work, and maybe they can come in and just sort of drop that one bunker buster bomb and then kind of say, okay, well, we've done our part. I think that Trump knows that this wouldn't be sort of the same sort of situation, I think, with Iraq and Afghanistan. Probably not, especially with the number of the population disliking regime. It doesn't appear that there would be, a lot of street combat and whatnot. So that is where it is very different. It is dangerous, but at the same time, like I said, with the Iranian people really hating the regime, that is promising for Israel and the United States.
Sarah, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up to this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Dan and Sarah. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug, with an update on the shootings from Minnesota. Let's go to our JD Davidson.
Over the weekend, the shooting of the Minnesota former House Speaker and a state senator captivated the nation. Joining me today is John Stife, a reporter for the Center Square, who helped cover the incidents as they unfolded over a 3 or 4 day span. John, tell us a little bit about where we stand right now.
Vance Boelter is in federal custody. He has both state and federal charges ranging from murder to stalking. And essentially what's going to occur is he's going to face these federal charges first. So the state murder charges will be delayed till later, and the federal counts may be increased as they go more through the case. But they charged, as the U.S. attorney said, what they could right now. And it's going to be a long process of going through all the evidence, all of the writings that he had, all of the information that they collected to kind of determine and be able to prove how much of this was premeditated, which they believe all of it was, and kind of the other things that he went through in order to attack these people and kind of hide his identity while he was doing it in order to continue the killings after the first ones that he's accused of.
One of the interesting parts of this story for me is I'm based in Ohio. But I happened to be in Minneapolis over the weekend. Saturday, as the day unfolded, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is they said there were 20 SWAT car. They apprehended him late Sunday night. They had 20 SWAT teams looking for him throughout both the Twin Cities. I spent the day covering both of the Twin Cities just because I was there for personal reasons. Never saw a police car, just saw one police car the entire day. But it was in some areas of the city it was all people were talking about. In some areas of the cities that we were in, nobody was talking. You would never know anything happened. Talk a little bit about the apprehension, the day and a half hunt for him and his wife, and then what eventually led to his capture.
Well, it was wild because police actually saw him and met him at the lawmaker's house before the shooting and killing of the last two people. A police officer drove past him, saw him in a car with his license plate from items he purchased at Fleet Farm that literally just said police on the back. He just looked straight forward. He had the silicone mask on. And the one police officer who went to that lawmaker's house just went to the house, checked on her, waited for backup. And by the time that came, he was gone. So then they found him at another house when he was killing the Hoffmans, and allegedly he's been accused of killing the Hoffmans. And then, he escaped out the back door. And the problem then for him is he's on foot. So what happened was he found a guy at a bus stop in a downtown area and purchased a Buick and an electric bike from the guy. He first offered to purchase the electric bike, and then the guy gave him a ride to his house and sold him the Buick too. So he was able to leave the area and get closer to where his home was in Green Isle. And what ended up being the key to them finding him was they received a tip of a guy on an electric bike that looked like Boelter, because photos had been distributed, photos from him wearing a cowboy hat when he went to the bank to get the money he emptied out his account in order to purchase the Buick and the electric bike. And there were a couple other photos, including one with the mask. So then they were able to kind of figure out what several mile area, and it's remote. It was a wooded area. And so
an hour southwest of Minneapolis, I believe.
Yeah. And so they found the Buick there, and knowing that they had already talked to the person that had sold them those items after figuring that out, they used like a robot and drone to go check that the Buick wasn't booby trapped. And then they looked inside, and there was a note from him inside about it. And ultimately they were able to corner him, and they were using drones. All these SWAT teams were there, and he crawled out eventually to police, and they were able to apprehend him alive, to face these charges late Sunday night. But it was a very, I guess, controlled search for him, because he wasn't necessarily a danger to the general public. They didn't know that, but these were very targeted killings that he had researched for a long time. And he had notes about addresses of these politicians, and it wasn't just politicians from the state of Minnesota. It was also some from Wisconsin, some from Illinois, other areas.
And those writings found in the Buick, and also I believe in what he was driving when he allegedly committed the crimes,
and in the house where he was staying with a roommate that wasn't where his family was at.
Right. And those writings were police originally, in the very first press conference Saturday morning, termed it a manifesto, but I think we're learning now it's more just kind of notes and writings and things like that. But I think that's what pushed it nationally, because I know in Ohio, security around lawmakers and at the state house has been increased, and Wisconsin also, security has been increased. And like you said, it wasn't just Minnesota. It was, I think it's safe to say that the majority of the names were probably Minnesotans. But it stretched for lack of a better term, the hit list stretched across several states.
Right. And the U.S. attorney was clear that it's not just one list. It's a series of essentially notepads that he wrote information on, and there were names here and there. So right away they said, oh, there were 75 names. And then later on they said, okay, there's 45 Minnesota lawmakers who were named, and they were working outside of that to kind of figure out things. But it's not like he had a list, like here's a prioritized list of people. It was just like, here's research on this person, here's some on that. And it was about where they live, where he could search for them, what their family members were. And hence the stalking charges. The lawmakers that he ultimately is accused of attacking first were ones that he had the most research on. And a couple of lawmakers ended up fortunate. One of them that he went to their home was out of town. Another, like mentioned earlier, the police happened to show up, and he was scared off before he went to the door. And she ended up making a statement about that and how her life was saved because that officer showed up when she did.
Well, what we've talked about today is just the beginning. This is a story that's going to stretch weeks and months and most likely years before there's a finalized. John, thanks for joining us today. And we'll have much more at the Center Square as this story develops.
A big thanks to JD and John. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the Nippon U.S. Steel merger, let's now go to Eliana Kernodle.
Today we're talking about the U.S. Steel merger with Japanese-based Nippon Steel and what Senator Kim Ward had to do with that process. Joining me to tell us more about this is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. So you got an exclusive with Senator Kim Ward, who has been a big supporter of this deal. Can you tell us about it? Kim Ward's district is actually in Southwest PA. Her family was very much in the steel industry. Her father worked in it in the 70s and 80s and lost his job in the downturn of the industry at that time. So she knows firsthand how devastating losing a company like U.S. Steel would be to the region, to the state's culture, to the people that she represents most of all. And what I found the most interesting about this story with Kim Ward is that I also talked to the mayor of West Mifflin, which is one of the cities that are impacted by U.S. Steel and Nippon investing and having this partnership. And he's actually never met Kim Ward, but he said that he was so incredibly grateful to her advocacy. She was the only state lawmaker behind the scenes that was pushing for this when no one else would. And he made the joke to me that he would like to have a Kim Ward Day and throw a parade for her because without her, he doesn't think that this would happen. And one of the things that she said about why she fought so hard for thousands of workers that she's never even met is because of the legacy of Pennsylvania and because she knew it's her job as a lawmaker to protect Pennsylvania's economy, to grow it. And the idea that we could lose U.S. Steel to, they were talking about moving their headquarters from Pittsburgh to down in Arkansas or somewhere in the South. And to imagine Pennsylvania without U.S. Steel, I don't think I have to go very far for anyone who lives here to understand the impact of that. And their football team is named the Steelers. So it would just be such an ideological blow to the region, as well as there were companies on the domestic side, like Ohio-based Cleveland Cliffs, who wanted to buy U.S. Steel for half the price. And so then we would just lose the company to them. So Kim Ward really fought for what she thought was the best deal. Now, I think there was a lot of hesitance, even from the mayor in West Mifflin, who said, Nippon's based in Japan, U.S. Steel needs to be a domestically owned company. What if they just want to break up the union? There was all of these concerns that a lot of people at first shared, but the West Mifflin mayor, Chris Kelly, said that went away when he actually went to visit other Nippon factories in West Virginia and in other states in the country. He said that the people in those regions said that without Nippon, they would have nothing. And so that's when the tide was turned for him. And that's where Kim Ward's messaging really came in, because she too understood that in a way that was getting lost in the reporting or in the entire discussion about it, really. And throughout this whole process, early on, even Trump had been opposed to this deal, but Ward continued to kind of support it throughout that. What was kind of her take on that experience?
She was hopeful. She felt, not only did she know that Trump could make this happen, but she believed that he would make the deal better. And I think there's a lot of argument that he did. He got Nippon to increase their investment in steel mills that are not only in Pennsylvania, but in Indiana as well. Workers are getting a $5,000 bonus. We have something that's called the golden share, which means the U.S. maintains majority ownership, although Nippon is investing. So that means that we make a majority of the decisions, like we have the deciding vote in a lot of things. So that really, in effect, keeps it U.S. controlled. And he felt that with all of those qualifications met, that this was the best path forward. What's important to know about Nippon is that they have the money, they can invest in the steel mills, upgrade them, and make them more compliant with climate action goals and other things that have been hurting the steel industry for decades. U.S. Steel tried themselves to update their facilities to do this a few years ago, but local officials in the county, they drug their feet. They denied permits because they were worried about the environmental impact. And that is exactly why U.S. Steel built a new facility down in Arkansas instead of expanding in Pennsylvania and stuff. So Kim Ward said at the time, she's like, I really don't want to see this happen again. So even though we got this success and Trump, made this deal and things are going forward, now Pennsylvania has to make sure that they don't stand in their own way, that the regulations don't make permits take over a year and don't really slow down this process so that the entire point of the deal is defeated.
But you did also mention, there is some kind of criticism, suspicion around the deal, especially, there's been some concerns about the timeline of the partnership and what that will look like. Can you get into that a little?
United Steelworkers Union continues to be opposed to this deal. They don't think that whatever is, what Trump has made happen is really any different than what the company was proposing back in December of 2023. Their entire argument is that Nippon is going to find a way to wiggle out of its agreements in Pennsylvania so that they can relocate south because there aren't collective bargaining agreements there. And this is something that, like I said before, concerned a lot of union workers in the state. But over time, and looking at the writing on the wall, that tide has changed. But as far as the leadership of the union, their mind has not changed. One of the things that they pointed to as being suspicious is that there is a 14-month timeline for these investments in these steel mills. And they said that just so happens to align with the end of their current collective bargaining contract. So they're concerned that that's where the wiggle room is for Nippon to potentially back out. I'm not an expert in collective bargaining agreements, but there was a time that the union was arguing that the contract that Nippon was proposing would give them leverage to leave the state in the event of a work stoppage or a strike. My sources that I've talked to said that that's kind of disingenuous and not entirely true. But like I said, not an expert in this, so I can't go too deep into the weeds. But essentially, they are completely unchanged from their position that they've held for the last 18 months.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. And I'm sure we'll continue to follow it as we see how it actually plays out in real time. And viewers can follow this and more at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.
Thanks to Eliana and Kristen. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Do Californians approve of the state's growing budget? What is going on with virtual school funding in Tennessee? And why is rent growth decelerating? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. President Donald Trump vowed to expand mass deportations of illegal immigrants after last weekend's nationwide protests against his immigration policies. Trump said the federal government must expand efforts to detain and deport illegal aliens in America's largest cities, such as Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, where millions of illegal immigrants reside. Some blue state governors pushed back, arguing his deportation efforts are what's stirring the unrest. North Carolina Democrat State Representative Julie Von Hafen is under fire for an image she posted to social media. Taken at a No Kings rally last Saturday, the photo shows a woman holding signage on a pole with an image of a bloody guillotine reading, quote, "In these difficult times, some cuts may be necessary," end quote. And prop heads on either of the poll, one representing a beheaded Donald Trump and the other bearing a Nazi swastika. Republicans called for her resignation. North Carolina Democrat Party Chairwoman Anderson Clayton called the outrage manufactured. Von Haven apologized for her actions on Thursday. It's not just lower-income people or those with disabilities using Medicaid in the United States. A new investigation led by the Patient First Coalition found that tens of thousands of wealthy people remained enrolled in Medicaid, the taxpayer-funded health insurance program meant for low-income and disabled Americans. The group defines wealthy as anyone with $1 million or more in assets. The issue is costing American taxpayers over $200 billion a year, the Patient First Coalition says. It is advocating for the federal government and states to follow the law and scrub ineligible people from the rolls. Two major food companies say they're ending the use of all petroleum-based food dyes in their products after U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. called for their ban. General Mills is joining Kraft Heinz in deciding to remove food dyes from its products. General Mills produces popular cereal brands such as Cocoa Puffs and Cookie Crisp, as well as the Betty Crocker brands. Kraft Heinz produces such brands as Heinz Ketchup, Kraft Dinner, Oscar Mayer, and Philadelphia Cream Cheese. President Trump, in an Oval Office briefing with cabinet heads, said it's time to, quote, "wean off of FEMA," unquote. That is in reference to the Federal Emergency Management Agency that responds to natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes. Trump, who has been critical of the agency in the past, said his administration plans to turn such emergency responses back over to the states. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the California state budget and residents' opinions on it, let's now go to Keegan Kernodle.
Today we're talking about California passing a new budget, a $325 billion budget. And there are polls suggesting people want less taxes. Kenneth, welcome, and let's get into this.
Hey, Keegan. So the Public Policy Institute of California has run this survey on Californians for decades. They've been asking Californians since 2003 about whether or not they want a government that has higher taxes and more services or lower taxes and less services. From 2003 until 2023, the majority of Californians said yes. I happily will pay more taxes or have other people pay more taxes so that we can have more services. That flipped in 2023 and has since expanded to now 55% of Californians now want less taxes and less services from their government. Less taxes and fewer services from their government. At the same time, though, the California legislature just passed a record $325 billion preliminary budget. That's not including federal spending. Final details are still going to be hammered out when the new fiscal year starts on July 1st, but they met their constitutional requirement to pass a budget so they can keep collecting their paychecks, because in our California legislature, these people are full-time. This is their full-time job, just representing the people. Putting this in context, though, state spending has doubled while the population has remained flat over the past decade. So per capita spending has doubled. At the same time, salaries for government employees have just skyrocketed. Since 2019 alone, state employee salaries have gone up 42%. The average employee of the state of California now earns $177,000 a year. That's a lot of money and a lot more than the average household makes. The average household of two working people makes. And it doesn't seem like we're getting a hell of a lot for our money that we're paying in California taxes, which does suggest why the majority of Californians now want a smaller government in return for less taxes.
What specifically are people saying about this?
I mean, we can look at the polling even on the very costly provision of taxpayer financed Medi-Cal to illegal immigrants. 58% of Californians don't want illegal immigrant adults to keep receiving coverage. That's according to the PPIC poll. There are a lot of costs that are imposed by this. The federal budget bill includes a provision that would cut the Medicaid expansion reimbursement rate from the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act expanded Medicaid coverage and enrollment eligibility, and that came with a different reimbursement rate than other parts of Medicaid. Anyhow, there's a 10% cut for that expansion included in the new bill for states that allow for illegal immigrants to enroll. That 10% cut would cost California about $11.2 billion a year. Meanwhile, this budget includes $12.1 billion a year for continuing to cover adult illegal immigrants. That is, so we're really seeing a total cost over $20 billion for continuing to provide this.
You also had some comment from a state senator too on just the budget in general.
Yes. Well, State Senator Roger Niello, who is the vice chair of the budget at the state Senate, he said that this budget continues to overspend while hoping for growth in revenue instead of cautiously preparing for the worst. A budget that is based on hope is a budget that is destined for despair. I think this warning makes sense when you look at the structure of California's tax revenue. We have some of the most volatile tax revenue in the nation because we're not really relying on taxing wages, taxing sales to make our revenue work out. We're pretty much going purely off the stock market. We get the capital gains is where we get our state revenue. The stock market is extremely expensive right now, suggesting that there isn't a lot more room for gains and that people could, if, conditions change, have losses, which will, result in less tax revenue. So if we have really any impact in capital markets here, there's a lot that can go wrong. We're really not going to have as much money as we think we will. And that will lead to a need to borrow money, cut services, raise other taxes. But again, as we talked about that poll, the majority of Californians don't want to pay more taxes. So there's really one choice left, which is to cut spending. We've mostly gone for budget gimmicks where we shift funds from year to year. We shift funds between funds. We'll do things like count a certain payroll as one fiscal year instead of the other fiscal year to reduce the on-paper cost. We're really out of those one-time gimmicks because we've been relying on those one-time gimmicks for so long. All of this comes to a head in the next couple of years. The Legislative Analyst's Office looked at the governor's new revised budget, which is pretty close to the $325 billion budget that was passed. And it says that we're going to have annual budget deficits in the $10-20 billion range for the next few years, really, until we make changes to how we're spending our money. Governor of California terms out fairly soon. There's a new governor's race in 2026. New governor is going to have a lot of spending to cut or a lot of new taxes to raise or some combination of both because the fiscal situation is not sustainable in California.
Well, thank you, Kenneth. And thank you everyone for joining us. Readers can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Keegan and Kenneth. You listen to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on K-12 funding questions in Tennessee, let's go now to Eliana Crudo.
Tennessee lawmakers are questioning why 2 counties with virtual schools are reaping thousands in state funding at the expense of the state's other 93. Joining me to dig into this is the Center Square's Kim Jarrett. Kim, there's kind of a quirk of how students are counted and how that affects funding at the heart of this discussion. Could you lay out the situation for us?
Yeah, it's a lot of math. I don't like math except baseball math and crafting math. So, but I've actually had to do a lot of studying and understanding. So Tennessee enacted this funding formula a few years ago, and it's based on a 70-30%. The state pays 70%, but counties will pay 30% into this formula based on their fiscal capacity. So basically a state like Nashville, Davidson County, they're putting in 18% of this funding formula because of their tax base. They could pay more. Some of those smaller counties, a lot of them are putting in less than 1%. It's also based on how many students you have. So what has happened with these virtual schools, the county that we're not picking on them. We just use them as an example in our story. Johnson County, Tennessee has about 17,982,000 people. They have 1,837. Hopefully my math is right. I did my own addition. And this is all of this information is taken from the Tennessee Department of Education's website. So they have 1,837 attending school in person, but they have 2,811 attending their virtual schools there. So basically they're getting school funding out of the base formula based out of state funding. They get credit for those students, and it reduces their capacity to pay into what all the other counties are paying in. Basically that 30% that all of Tennessee's 95 counties are paying into. And basically this actually came up at a Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations last week. And it was just an interesting thing we just picked up on. Basically what they said is virtual students are considered students in their host county. So these students that are being counted in Johnson County, they might actually live in Davidson County or some of the larger counties, but Johnson County gets credit for those, and has Johnson County, because of their high number of students, has their physical capacity to pay into this 30% funding formula decreases. That means that the other 93 counties or 94 have to pick it up. We found in the report there are 56 of these virtual schools throughout the state, but Union County, which is another very small county in Tennessee, Union and Johnson have the majority of these virtual schools and are reaping the benefits of the students who do not live in their county.
That is really interesting. You would think that it would be based just purely on where you reside.
That question was brought up. Senator Heidi Campbell said during the meeting, she goes, we have to know where these students live. Why aren't we, adding them into the funding formula for where they're located? And that's a question that right now has not been answered as to, well, why are these smaller counties getting all the credit?
And there has sort of hand in hand with this, there's been concerns about how these virtual schools are actually doing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So Tennessee Department of Education gives all schools a grade, and they look every year. So you can go to their website and you can find out how well that school is doing. For example, the two virtual schools in our story in Johnson County received a D grade. Some of the other virtual schools, they have lower grades. Now, it was mentioned to me by a source that they are virtual schools that are operated by the school systems, and those tend to get higher grades than these that are operated by private companies. So so not all of the virtual schools are getting these low grades, but it seems to be, looking at what we've seen from the Tennessee Department of Education, a lot of the private companies, their schools get D's, and in some cases, at least D. We've seen a lot of D's. I haven't seen an F yet, but there may be one.
Yeah. And I know this is something that, most states have these virtual schools, but every state is different. Their funding formulas are different.
Yeah, right. It's all the funding I've covered a lot of states for the Center Square in my time here, and every school has a different funding formula. But I've been noticing, particularly in Georgia, I cover Georgia and Tennessee, they're having a lot of these virtual schools. I'm seeing people on Facebook that I know saying, hey, my child is going to a virtual school. Let me clarify this to you, because this question has been raised a few times. This is not home, like when a school, like during the pandemic, everybody was virtually schooled. This is totally different. These are virtual schools that parents can use. Say, I don't want to send my child to school, but I don't want to do the homeschooling. I don't want to supervise it. So they sign up for these virtual schools. So it has nothing to do with the pandemic, just to be clear, because that question was raised by a reader. So yeah, we don't know if this other funding formulas other schools with their funding formulas across the country are having the same issues with virtual schools skewing the funding formula. I think one of the things that is going to be looked at is, why don't we just list these students as where they live, and then they will be, they'll be given credit. Say if they go to virtual school in Johnson County, but they live in Davidson would get the funding for that student. There is going to be, in Tennessee, the chairman of the committee agreed, there is going to be a report. I'm working on some follow-ups to this, and we haven't heard the last of this issue. That committee will do a report. They're going to delve deeper into this.
Yeah, and I know these schools have been around for a while. I personally went to an online school in high school, so I'm a little bit more familiar with it, and that was prior to the pandemic. So they've definitely picked up a lot of speed, and it's become a lot more of a question that I've been seeing a lot about, especially post-pandemic. It's been much more common, but they were around before then. But I think as they've grown, a lot of these concerns about how you navigate funding is becoming a bigger and bigger question. Well, thank you for your insights on this story. Viewers can follow this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Aliana and Kim. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Join me to discuss rent growth trends. It's PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. The Zillow put its market report out for rentals, and we talk about the housing industry. I mean, obviously, you've got some keen insight, being a big deal at the Z, but we talk about the housing industry on this show because it makes up such a huge portion, right, of like personal economics.
I mean, yeah, right. Like what do you spend most of your money on?
Right. Shelter, food, right. Clean water, air. I mean, they're pretty important things. So, the numbers, came in, and you said that you were somewhat caught off guard by these numbers. So can we sort of walk through kind of like, for example, like the typical rent now is about $2,050 a month, nationally, right? That's up about, just under 0.5% at 0.4%, and up 3.2% over a year ago. So, what's moving the market? Why is the market moving as it is?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think the big surprise in May was the fact that, people tend to move, especially renters, they tend to move in the summer, right? As you get into the summer, you see a big increase in activity. Rent growth tends to accelerate. The share of rental listings with the concessions tends to decrease as the rental market tightens. It's kind of the normal seasonal thing. But, you look at these numbers, and in May, you actually had a deceleration in rent growth, right? And I think that's pretty surprising given, of course, given the seasonal patterns that we expect. But at the same time, given the fact that, new construction pulled back significantly and that we were expecting rent growth to kind of firm up a little bit. And so things are changing. I think things are changing because, if you think about it, the housing inventory on the for sale market, housing inventory is up 20% from a year ago. So we have a big increase in housing inventory. And when you have a big increase in housing inventory, it doesn't just affect, it's not just buyers that have more options. Well, prospective first time buyers happen to be renters as well. And so renters also have more options to choose from, and it gives them more bargaining power. And so it helps to explain why rent growth could be cooling, faster than expected this year.
Let me ask you this question. How close to par for the average, rent versus the average starter home?
I think that's a great question.
On a monthly basis. And
that's a great question. I mean, if you look at the typical home, in the for sale market right now, it's now if you looked at just the monthly payment, right?
Yeah.
The monthly payment is now about $100 higher than the monthly payment on the typical single family rental.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's shocking to most people because it used to be that buying was the easy decision because buying used to be $400 cheaper before the pandemic. It just made sense to be buying. Right. And so that decision is not quite straightforward anymore because it actually costs more to be a buyer in today's environment than it is to be renting.
The obstacle, though, still being the down payment for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In markets like San Francisco, you would have to come up for the typical household, right? Median income household.
Yeah.
They'd have to come up with a $875,000 down payment in order just to keep their monthly cost at 30% of their income. Right. And so that's just completely out of reach. No wonder home ownership rates are so low on the coast, right? In San Francisco, Northern California, and Pacific Northwest. Whereas in a market like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the typical household with a $7,000 down payment can actually afford the mortgage, right? And so the barrier to entry is much lower in the Midwest, which is why we're seeing a lot more activity, housing market activity in the Midwest. And the Northeast of the United States, and when I say the Northeast, I'm talking about Buffalo, Hartford, Connecticut, not New York, right? New York is still active, but it's very expensive still.
Yeah. The multifamily sector, you wrote about that. This is something that I think you're somewhat passionate about as like a home hacking. It's like it would be on your home hacking list. Is there any sort of glimmer of hope in that space?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's for younger renters, it's the place to be because rents there are very, very low, right? Rents in the multifamily sector are, I want to say $400 or $500 cheaper for renting the typical apartment relative to renting a single family, right? Being in a single family rental.
Right.
And so there's an advantage there. The advantage comes from the fact that the reason prices have been somewhat tame, it was the fact that we had a 50-year high in multifamily construction, right? So you're building a bunch of apartment buildings. All that supply has helped to kind of, tame rent growth in the multifamily space.
Yeah. Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug. And on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.